My lords, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Dean Godson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange. My pleasure to host you all tonight for one of the great events in our history. Pleasure to have for this very important book, History of Capitalism in America, two of the great figures in the financial world of the post-war era. Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, Alan Greenspan, former Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, will be joining us on live video link shortly. And of course, the co-author of Alan Greenspan, Adrian Wooldridge, The Economist, badgered columnist, former fellow of All Souls, and one of the most distinguished thinkers on politics, political economy in these times here in the UK. We'll be slightly inverting the normal order of proceedings, where the questions won't be being directed at the Governor of the Bank of England, but he will be doing the interviewing himself. We said we'd provide him with a nice, safe space, and I hope that's what it'll prove, though seeing one or two of the more unruly members of this audience who've asked awkward questions in the past. I'm not holding my breath here very long, but anyhow, it's a privilege to have him there. The Governor will do 10 minutes opening remarks about the book, and then we'll start the interview proceedings with the two co-authors. So please join me in welcoming them and for what I know will be a stellar evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. And you're absolutely right. I am very much relieved not to be answering questions this evening, asking them instead. Just in case anyone is tempted otherwise, I'm in policy purdah, so I'm unable, even more so than usual, to say anything of practical significance. But I'm here because, as Dean just said, this promises to be a very vibrant and fascinating conversation or presentation from Adrian and Alan on their new book, Capitalism in America. When they were describing, in the book, when they describe the 1970s, the disappointments of the 1970s, they describe how, and I quote, "the political system began to generate antibodies to the virus of malaise." And what our authors were speaking of at that time was the growth of a new type of institution designed to bridge the gap between policy thinking and political practice. And policy exchange is exactly that type of institution, multidisciplinary, highly influential, the productive force at the heart of Westminster and our political system. And it's at events like this where radical thoughts challenge orthodoxy, and a culture of cross-disciplinary thinking fosters the creation of new ideas. Challenge, disruption, creation, and tonight we have just the catalyst. Adrian Wooldridge is the political editor of The Economist, served as Washington bureau chief, as well as the West Coast correspondent for that magazine, that newspaper, I should say. Sorry, you called me out. He has a profound knowledge of many things, including the US political system. He's not known to us officially as the author of the Badgett column, although those in the know that he is. But he is known to us as author of 9 previous books ranging across economics, America, world history, and beyond. Alan Greenspan, of course, is a titan of economic policy. His career has been grounded in an encyclopedic knowledge of economic data, upon which he built, amongst other things, a highly successful private consulting business. His views have been consistently sought not only by the giants of business, but also the leaders of the free world. He was an advisor to Richard Nixon during his presidential campaign, and of course served 3 years as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Gerald Ford. He was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1987 by Ronald Reagan. He would go on to serve under George H.W. Bush through Bill Clinton's 2 terms and 6 years into George W. Bush's presidency. He presided over one of the most prosperous periods in American history, and he's rightly celebrated by policymakers across geographic borders and political persuasions. And I had the great privilege when I was a G7 deputy of overlapping with him at the G7 for 3 years, and I can attest that every word he spoke was given the highest consideration, as they will be this evening. So let me say a few words about the book before getting into some questions. And the book begins with a small thought experiment, and I quote, "Imagine a version of the World Economic Forum was held in Davos in 1620. So cold, bad food, too many breakout sessions, that sort of thing. And the question that comes up for debate at the 1620 Davos is, who will dominate the world in the coming centuries? So of the many candidates, few of those present would have looked to North America. It would have seemed then like a, quote, an empty space on the map without prospects. Well, of course, that empty space is now the world's largest economy in market terms. It's an economy that is as huge as it is diverse, and its success has afforded its citizens the highest standards of living. And the book charts this history of this land, rich in resources and bubbling with ideas, and tell the story of U.S. development up to the modern day in order to answer the question, what is the source of America's success? Of course, there is a vast literature on the success of economies. Some emphasize the land, citing a favorable environment that's navigable, habitable, and conducive to free trade. Others laud institutions, good governance ensuring property rights are protected, and inclusive democratic institutions that build the social capital that political economists from Adam Smith to Hayek see as the foundation of successful market economies. Our authors note those, but see America as a special case. A favorable environment, yes. Good governance, mostly. But they see America's success as a result of something more. Its unique appreciation for the power of creative destruction. Advances in productivity that allow us ever greater output from a set of inputs. Productivity's ability to rapidly improve living standards makes it arguably the single most important measure of economic success. But what drives productivity growth, and how can it continue? And in the book, Alan and Adrian use one of Joseph Schumpeter's core insights, and they argued that the key is creative destruction. In other words, to allow creation, we must accept destruction. In the maelstrom of progress, as new ideas, methods, and processes replace the old, there will inevitably be winners and losers. And it's the role of politics to determine how to deal with the individuals that lose as society as a whole grows richer. Politics for our authors defines the government's reach into the space in which creative destruction takes place. America's philosophy has been to resist the temptation to interfere with the remorseless logic of creative destruction. The ethos of entrepreneurialism and business means productivity is facilitated, not frustrated, with benefits that can span decades. And in the book, they cite the post-Civil War laissez-faire decade of the 1880s, which gave rise to more than 10% of today's Fortune 500 companies, more than any other decade until the Reagan era. Now today, some argue that America's growth model is at a crossroads. Looking more like other advanced economies, America's dynamism is being held back. Geographical mobility has been falling steadily since the 1980s, and social mobility, the very heart of the American dream, has stalled and begun to go into reverse. Falling productivity and rising inequality of opportunity could have important social consequences. For those no better off than their parents, living in a society where real wages have flattened for decades, frustrations are vented in what Alan and Adrian term an increasingly paralyzed and dysfunctional political space. They also warn that another financial crisis could destroy the faith in American capitalism. And perhaps most perniciously, American public and private savings rates have been in steady decline. Not unrelatedly, and this was a key point in the book, entitlement spending has tripled as a proportion of GDP over Adrian's lifetime, driving up federal debt in a process, I quote, as adamantine and inescapable as far as the eye can see, with the potential to crowd out risk-taking until American exceptionalism is a distant memory. And as well these days, monopoly and mercantilism are ascendant, the perennial gale of competition and international commerce under pressure. And if I may, as an aside, point out that Schumpeter warned exactly against such tendencies towards fettered capitalism. To the creator of the term, creative destruction was driven in a quest for the profits and quiet life of the monopoly. But once the monopoly is achieved, and to be clear, that's achieved through hard work, innovation, and dynamism, great efforts can be spent to lobby government policies in order to entrench advantage. If these efforts are successful, corporate bureaucracies would stifle entrepreneurial spirit from within, and what Schumpeter called the treason of the intellectuals would attack it from without. So having diagnosed the malaise, our authors prescribe two remedies. First and most forcefully, they argue for a smaller state, focusing on reducing Social Security spending, cutting back burdensome regulation, thereby ensuring the time and wealth of America is put to productive use. Second, our authors recognize the paramount importance of financial stability, arguing for a substantial increase in bank capital to ensure that the financial system serves its function while helping to restore public faith in a system that has brought so much prosperity. So, to conclude, capitalism in America raises many of today's most pertinent economic questions. Whither fiscal discipline? How important is foreign competition to the process of creative destruction? How do we ensure the energy of an innovative financial sector is put towards increasing prosperity? And also, should finance be the one sector to which creative destruction does not apply? How to help those livelihoods that are destroyed by the creative process? And finally, well, not finally, but finally for me, what is the role of institutions during the next technological revolution? If Alan Greenspan's high school contemporary Henry Kissinger is correct, is he correct, when he suggests that artificial intelligence is how the Enlightenment ends, and will it take with it laissez-faire economics? I'm sure we'll see a flash of creative spark this evening when discussing these and many other important issues. Thank you for your attention. I'm now going to sit down. Alan is going to appear on our screens, and I'll ask a few questions before turning to the audience. Thank you. Fantastic. So far, so good. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
You have
Adrian.
You have a packed auditorium and a rapt audience. And if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a few questions first. And given the focus on creative destruction in your book, which is a fantastic book, I have to say, given the focus on that, I wanted to go back to Schumpeter and his warning in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy that capitalism itself could tend towards increased concentration, to monopoly, and then a form of corporate socialism. But that hasn't happened over time in America. And so my question is, if you could expand a bit on what it is about the American system that has prevented that, and whether it's more at risk today.
I think the way to answer that is to say we were using Schumpeter really as an example of a certain type of process. As far as I'm concerned, we have not defined in the book, nor effectively anywhere else, what are the criteria one should employ to determine what is the optimum society structure? Now, Schumpeter goes back to Karl Marx, and we go through a whole series of political, economic structures. And as far as I can see, we haven't really yet come down to a point where we're getting criteria which we can use. I don't think, I never have thought, that the general view of Schumpeter per se, other than his very clever terminology, is where we're going. I think we have to ask the question, do we wish as our criterion to say what is the highest per capita real income as what our goal is? That is an objective goal. And the only thing we have to argue about is the means by which we calculate GDP. I say that not facetiously. There are serious questions about what is it that we measure when we create the gross domestic product. And my view is that that's all we have at the moment. We do have measures of income inequality, with the Gini coefficient. But when we go back in time and we ask ourselves, where did we come from in this political system? And the issue is that I will really hit the paddle across the Atlantic Ocean back to you, gentlemen, where it all started. It all started with basically the British Enlightenment. And we're working from there. And I think what we need to do, which we haven't done in this book, because it wasn't really all that relevant, is to come down to a set, how do we know whether our society has succeeded? This book does not do it. We try to determine certain criteria, but we haven't come down to the fundamental choices. Finally, let me just say, if I had an alternate to go at it, I would use creative destruction in a different context, meaning standards of living, which we're often talking about, rise when unit costs of production of that level of living fall. And that's basically where creative destruction is coming from. If you wanted to do it analytically in a statistically appropriate manner, the best way of doing it would be to measure unit cost, or if you're looking at something else, this is another thing, what is the weight of the GDP? And what does that imply? Because clearly the whole issue of climate control and the like all rest on issues other than GDP and essentially the measure of that. So let me just stop there and expose myself to questions.
Let me say a little bit about concentration, because I think the problem with the United States is not necessarily concentration, it's complacency. So between about 1860 and 1900, you have a fantastic degree of concentration. I mean, US Steel comes from nothing to being the biggest company in the world, Carnegie Steel as it was then. Standard Oil also becomes a giant company, incredibly, I mean, they have about 90% of market share or even more than that, and yet they're very, very innovative companies. So Andrew Carnegie, in the 1880s, he builds a brand new, fantastic new steel works, and then he reads somewhere about a new steel production process that's better, and his first instinct then is to tear down this entire steelworks and build another one, because he's very nervous, he's very worried about competition. So he remains an astonishing innovator. And so between 1860 and 1900, the unit costs of steel go down by about 90%, the same for oil, about 90%. So you have giant companies which are destroying the competition essentially, but nevertheless are doing so through a process of innovation and massive cost destruction. Then, in about 1900, you get concentration which is linked to complacency. So you get the creation of US Steel, which takes over from Carnegie Steel and ceases essentially to innovate and ceases to reduce costs. So it's a market-dominant company, just as Carnegie Steel was, but it's a complacent company that doesn't feel the breath of competition. So I don't think it's just a matter of dominance, it's a matter of the perception of competition. And these companies which are created by entrepreneurs, these entrepreneurs are restless people who never stop feeling paranoid, essentially. They're paranoid people. The other secret that America does have in terms of destroying these concentrations of power is every now and again it has a decade of destruction. So you go into the 1970s and 1980s with very large steel companies, very large car companies, very large and dominant electronics companies, and then and AT&T sitting there dominating the telecommunications market, and then you have a period of globalization, very bad trade union relations, plus aggressive antitrust policy, which breaks up AT&T. So you have these periods when it looks as though America's becoming a complacent, oligopolistic country, and then the creative destruction reasserts itself. Perhaps that's going to happen again. So I think that the 1970s and early 1980s was absolutely vital in reasserting the creative power when you had the power of creative destruction, when you'd had these car companies like General Motors and the rest of it, and US Steel becoming very, very complacent.
Yeah. So maybe I could just take it to the present day first, because the last bit of Adrian's answer alluded to what sort of decade or what sort of period are we in now in America? In certain industries, as a consequence of great innovation, concentration is rising. So you have the fruits of innovation. And unit costs, to pick up on something Alan said, are very, very low. Marginal cost in the, Alan, I'm thinking of the tech, a series of tech applications and sectors where marginal cost is not that distinguishable from zero.
Yeah.
Concentration's risen. Maybe I'll start with Adrian because he led into it and then go to you, Alan. But how do you feel in terms of the competitive dynamics in the U.S. today? I want to come back onto entitlements and come on to finance, but start on this if I could.
Well, I start off with Carnegie and Rockefeller, and there's an extraordinary similarity between Carnegie and Rockefeller on the one hand and the titans of tech at the moment. They've sort of sensed that the nature of the economy is changing, that it was changing in the 19th century from iron to steel and to oil. Here they're sensing that it's changing to microcomputers and the internet and the rest of it. They sense that the economy is changing. They see the potential of that change, and they've created companies. They've come up with ideas which have seized those opportunities, and they've done fantastically well. And they've done all the things that Carnegie and Rockefeller did, which was to constantly to innovate, constantly to reduce unit costs. And they've created massively powerful companies in the process. But I rather feel that many of these companies are becoming like US Steel did after 1900. They've become so market dominant that they're not as innovative as they could be, that they're more concerned with eliminating competition. And you see a number of things going on. You see non-compete clauses whereby people are intellectual talent is captured and prevented from competing. You see them buying up lots and lots of small companies. It used to be the case if you were in Silicon Valley. In the 1990s, the people in Silicon Valley wanted to create their own great company. Now everybody wants to create an idea which they can sell out to one of the dominant companies, and those dominant companies will buy those companies and close down the ideas if they're a threat to them. And you see the use of lawyers. I think that that Google has about 50,000 employees, of which 1,000 are lawyers, and those lawyers are not in the business of tech innovation. They're in the business of suppressing tech innovation, I would say. So I think you're getting dominant companies that are becoming complacent companies, as it were. What's happening after 1900 is beginning to happen in America. That's my perspective. A great period of creative destruction and entrepreneurial capitalism is becoming a little less promising.
Right. Alan, I don't know if you want to expand on what Adrian just said, but can I tack on a related question to you, which is within financial services, within the financial sector, I wonder if you could point to some examples of creative destruction in finance, positive creative destruction in finance. I'm hoping you can, and I'd like to remind that I'm not going to answer any questions, so don't throw it back to me. But over to you, Alan.
The term does not apply to finance to the extent that it does in the rest of the economy. Finance is a means by which we organize ourselves in the financial system, and it's not the physical volume of unit cost. In other words, there is a creative destruction. I mean, you could start off with this simple construction of a calculator. A calculator enhances the capability of calculating the numbers on our balance sheets, but it's not a major force in the economy. And I know that everyone is looking for creative destruction in various different parts of the economy, but I don't think that's the way to look at it. I think the best way to look at it is just there's so many different ways in which standards of living, which I assume is the ultimate determination of policy, rise. And I would not put finance in that particular area except under certain circumstances. The real basic issue is, as Adrian points out in the book, take Henry Bessemer dealing with a remarkably new technology. What was it? Well, he made the mistake of leaving a particular crucible steel potential out in the open where some wind blew across it, creating a significant improvement in the oxygen content of the puddle, so to speak. That was the major change, because remember, steel largely was a British product, a special, it was sort of very rarely used, and most of it was produced in Sheffield, England. But the whole changes occurred in the context of how does the system change in a way that enhances human well-being. And I think what we have to start at, what we really don't do, is what is the standard by which we determine what is the best form of economic system. And we've been struggling with that for hundreds of years.
Very good.
I think as a consequence of that, capitalism has emerged as the form which has been most productive to human welfare.
I think venture capital funds would be one obvious example of a financial innovation which America pioneered and which has been undoubtedly to the good. I mean, in the mid-1990s, the United States had more California had more venture capital than the whole of Europe. I mean, I think that's something which probably benefited California quite a lot. I would say probably in some ways, this is more controversial, but I think junk bonds were probably in the end pretty innovative. They released a lot of value, a lot of very good companies, MCI, Barnes & Noble, Turner, CNN, all of these were funded by Michael Milken and his various friends and allies. So I think that America's innovations, particularly in the 1980s, I think the 1980s was a particularly significant period in terms of financial innovation, was extraordinarily valuable. And I think one of the things that strikes me about the United States now, if you go to the United States and you want to pay for something, you say, oh, contactless payment. They don't know what contactless payment is. You know, mobile payment. They don't know what mobile payment is. I mean, America is now actually strangely behind the curve in a lot of new financial innovation. You have very dominant companies. Again, I keep returning to this issue of dominance, but you have very dominant companies such as American Express and Visa, which have very high levels of profit. They have much higher levels of profit in the United States than outside the United States. And then they're not at the cutting edge of innovation. I think the United States is not on the cutting edge of innovation in a lot of, as I say, in mobile payments, in contactless payments. You know, quite often you say, how can I pay this? You sign a check. It's a long time since I've signed a check in the United Kingdom. And I think that if you go to China, again, it's all contactless, it's all mobile payments. If you go to Sweden, nobody knows what money is in the form of cash. So America is, again, having been at the forefront of innovation in finance, in a lot of ways it's not in the forefront of finance. And I don't think it's in the forefront of innovation in fintech either.
Very good. Something for us to have. I just as an aside, I was struck by this passage in the book, and a few members of the gentry here. In Britain, great entrepreneurs celebrate their success by winding down their businesses and buying an estate and a title. In America, there's no higher aristocracy than the aristocracy of entrepreneurs. Now,
That's true.
in fairness, this is referring to the Gilded Age in America, the age of Carnegie, Bessemer, and others, but just food for questions later on. I wanted to shift to entitlements and the fiscal position, because one of the core points in the book and one of the key policy prescriptions, if you will, is the need to reform entitlements in America. Alan, I'm going to ask you to speak to this if I could. And it is striking. I think I quoted it there. I didn't mean to give your age, Adrian, but that if from memory, just under 5% of GDP in entitlements in the mid-1960s to effectively 15% of GDP spent on entitlements today in the United States. And it's a difficult issue, but it's obviously a central issue. And Alan, I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on how we got here and where America should go.
Well, all starts in the United States with Franklin Roosevelt signing the Social Security legislation in 1935. It set in motion an extraordinary series of what we call in the States an entitlement. You call a social benefit or whatever. But the point being is that what we have found over the decades is that the rise in entitlements have, by sheer coincidence seemingly, been exactly offset by the decline in gross domestic savings. And in fact, the sum of the two as a percent of GDP have been remarkably stable since 1965, which is the period, remember, when the whole big surge in entitlements began to occur. And to this day, that particular relationship has been remarkably stable. And you can demonstrate very readily that as gross domestic savings is impaired, it must have necessarily reduced the capability of financing and hence producing capital goods. And capital goods are the means by which we create standards of living, by essentially doing productivity growth and all the characteristics which create a viable economy. And I think that what we have to deal with here is that, to remember, we're looking now in the United States at the source of financing of plant equipment or capital goods, and hence productivity. We're basically creating a system which is eventually going to unwind, because you cannot have what the United States is doing now, because we don't have enough savings, coming from our regular production process. We're now borrowing savings from abroad. We now have a net debt to foreigners of $8 trillion. That number was effectively zero a decade ago. And there are statistical limits here, which get us to the point of asking, where do we get the savings to create the capital goods which will continue to enhance our output per hour? And unless we can solve that problem, and it is obviously solvable, but as Adrian put it at the very end of the book about whether or not we have the political will or not, because fundamentally this issue is not economics. Economics are in question. It's political. And political gets to the issue of will.
Yeah. I'll just check with Adrian if he'd like to add something, but I'll alert the audience that I'd go to you for questions after Adrian. So if you can just signal, then I've got my first one, but go.
I just wanted to say on the issue of entitlements, I think that it's not that difficult in practical terms as opposed to political terms, and it's definitely not burdensome to the population to solve the entitlement problem. It's actually something that you can solve quite easily. You just have to increase the retirement age a bit, and you have to rejig the funding system a bit. And you're not imposing a lot of suffering on people. I mean, remember in 1935 when the entitlement system was first created, people were expecting probably to live 2 more years before they died, basically, on retirement. Now they're retiring at 67 and living for 20 more years. And so I think you could raise gradually the age of retirement, reduce the amount of money that the baby boomers are getting when they retire a little bit, and restore fiscal sanity. And remember as well that when the initial social security system was introduced, most people did very hard physical labor, and retirement was a blessing and a necessity. Now most people are doing fairly sedentary labor, and they probably in many ways don't need to retire or want to retire, because what they're doing is not as physically demanding, and it's probably intellectually quite stimulating. So I think that addressing the entitlement problem is not some dreadful, evil, reactionary thing. It's actually a very sensible reform. It's unfortunately the case that the system geared up to address it with the Bowles-Simpson legislation, and at the last moment backed down and failed to do that. One of the great failures of Obama's presidency, I think. But this is a problem that has to be solved, because otherwise the country is facing fiscal disaster, but can be solved without too much pain, any pain really.
Very, very good. Okay, so first questioner, Jesse Norman, yeah. Jesse, I think, yeah, microphone coming down.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Mark, and thank you, Adrian and Alan. What an absolutely magnificent conversation, and what a privilege it is to hear it. I want to ask a question that sits behind many of the things you've said, which is about competition policy. Now, the first question is there a problem with competition policy in America and in this country? And if it is true, Adrian, as you've said, that we're getting too many companies looking a little too much like US Steel, should we be looking towards a more energetic, activist, Sherman Act type, Rooseveltian competition policy? And if we are, and I'm actually asking that as a completely neutral question because I am interested in the topic, first of all, should it be different for what you might call established non-tech players than it should be from the platforms, which seem each in their own right to pose a very specific kind of problem for competition policy?
Alan, did you hear that?
How you can do that? I can't. We're dealing with fundamentals of how political systems work. If we, we look at the issue of our budget deficit opening up, and we know that's an unsustainable number, but the reason it does not get full vetting in the political system is deficits are not what are the issue. It's inflation, which is the issue. We learned over many decades that inflation becomes a politically, technically difficult problem to handle when the inflation rate is more than 5%. And that has been fairly general if you go back in history. When you get back in the relates to wage and price controls in August of 1971, which Nixon put on as a solution to the problem, which everyone knows wage and price controls have never worked, never will work, and they're attempting to break down a system which is where productivity comes from. So I don't see how we get around this because I don't think we're looking now at an issue of stagnation only. I think this is a really serious problem confronting us, which will occur only when we look at the size of the federal budget deficits and the amount of debt, which Congressional Budget Office, for example, projects at extraordinarily high levels. But we've learned from history that that has zero political impact unless and until it begins to hit the inflation side. We're only seeing the very early stages of what looks like to me to be stagflation, a combination of inflation and stagnation, which is what we experienced back in the 1970s and 80s, and it led to no good.
Great. Important point there on the, and in some respects, a bit of American exceptionalism in that case, given the fiscal doesn't matter.
Right,
or,
right.
I'm slightly paraphrasing, but inflation does, and it's the early stages. If I just rephrase part of Jesse's question around the nature of competition policy and your thoughts about whether you would bifurcate it, tailor it to some of the emerging giants today.
Well, I think America has two lots of problems with competition. It has the problem in the regular economy, that there's too much concentration in the regular economy, airlines and the rest of it. And it has a second separate problem in the platform economy, where platforms by their nature sort of tend towards monopoly because their utility depends on the number of people who use them. And I think it needs to address both of these problems. The platform is a much more complicated and difficult problem to address. And it is, or it was under Obama, beginning to address concentration. I think it's, I don't know about Trump, but I think it should continue to do so. But the problem with platforms is exceptionally difficult, and I think we have to sort of rethink a lot of competition policy. We need a sort of reverse Robert Bork, who can think about these things in a really fundamental way, but with slightly different prejudices from the original Robert Bork, I think. But we haven't basically seen competition policy and competition and thinking about competition catching up with the platform economy yet.
Okay. Big opportunity for younger members of the audience.
Absolutely.
Sir Paul Marshall next, please, in the middle here. And then
Thank you, and thank you for a wonderful book. I asked this question as a hedge fund manager, an huge admirer of Schumpeter and of creative destruction. But I think, and this is primarily to Alan Greenspan. But I think if Schumpeter had come back, he died and come back to life today and went to Washington, D.C., I think he would conclude that his dystopia had arrived, and with $2 billion a year spent on lobbying, and particularly in relation, I mean, there's obviously the technology sector, but the finance sector. And the finance sector saw a specific series of regulatory measures, particularly the blocking of the reforms of derivatives proposed by the CFTC, and then the introduction of the Leverage Act, which was probably the single biggest contributor to the problems in the finance sector. And then the highly selective bailouts of certain banks and not others. It would be difficult to conclude that that wasn't an example of cronyism gone very badly wrong. So do you agree at all with that depiction? And if you do, are there any changes you would make, particularly perhaps to lobbying rules and how the relationship between business and government is managed?
I think I lost most of that over the North Atlantic.
So Alan, can I try to, it's a very rich question, but can reduce it to, has the finance sector captured Washington to its advantage? And if so, what can be done to rectify it? What should be done to rectify that?
I'm not quite sure what that means. What did they do?
I'm on thin ice here. Sir Paul has suggested that there has been it's a bit of the variant of the amount of money spent on lobbying, billions of dollars spent on lobbying, a lot of that by the by the major banks, for example, that have affected aspects of Dodd-Frank, aspects of bank bailouts, aspects of derivative legislation. I mean, in your experience, have you seen that as an issue? Do you see that as an issue? It would have been, to link it back to the discussion in the book, one of the things that Schumpeter warned about, very much so, that success breeds this type of monopoly lobbying. Is that a problem in the financial system in America? And if so, should something be done about it?
Well, let me come at that question in a somewhat different manner. The issue is what caused the type of financial breakdown when the system fails us as it did in 2008 and in 1929 and in a few periods like 1893 and going back in time. But it's something wrong with the system, and what it is, it's human nature. We can't, it turns out that it's only very recently, collecting the information that we did in the events of 2008, what did we learn new? Well, we did. We learned for the first time, not only do you need a specific control, what are you, necessary conditions for an economic crisis such as the ones that happened in 1929 and 2008, is to have a toxic asset which creates a very significant erosion in the system. This would securitized mortgage recently, the brokers' loans back in 1929. But in addition, they have to be essentially leveraged. They have to, like, giving out brokers' loans at 10 or 15%, meaning an 85% amount of debt. That is a very fragile type of system. fragile financial systems are very dangerous and will create periodically something which nobody can anticipate in advance. I think 2008 is a classic example.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, what we argue in this book essentially is that the Dodd-Frank is the wrong sort of approach to the problem of future financial crises for many reasons, one of which is that it's written by and in many ways for lobbyists. And we argue that you need a much more general solution, which is to force all of these banks, all of these financial institutions to keep much more equity. And to have much less leverage, essentially. And that's that's a simple set of rules that can't be gamed by lobbyists, and everybody will have to do it. And if they do that, then the likelihood of contagious problems and financial crises is hugely reduced. So we do try and address that problem. And you are right, these lobbyists do spend a great deal of money on lobbying, and they're not giving it away for no reason.
I'll go quickly. Actually, I'll take the lady at the back and then Chris Giles.
Hi, Juliet Samuel from The Telegraph. Just as an aside, an example of financial creative destruction you could point to is the rise of index funds, which has reduced unit costs a lot. But my question is about the entitlements issue, and pensions are obviously one aspect of it, but it seems that the fastest rising aspects are health spending, old age care, and care for adults who survive now conditions that they wouldn't have survived in the past. And I wonder what the solution to that is when wages are stagnating. How can you get the savings rate up enough to counter or to pay for all of those things?
Al, I'm not sure, did that make it across the Atlantic?
Welcome. This is well, I don't know, I'll let Adrian take a shot at that.
Well, the problem of the costs of American healthcare is, I'm afraid, is well above my pay grade. It's incredibly difficult. I think America sort of falls between two stools. You can either give much more buying power to individuals, you can give much more buying power to the state, but to have this strange world where nobody really knows who's responsible means nobody's really in charge of reducing costs. Also, again, it may sound tedious, but you've got massive concentration in the healthcare industry with these huge hospital chains, again, which have very little incentive to reduce costs. So you need somebody who is in charge of the system, either as an individual purchaser, knowing that they want to get value for the money for their insurance money, or as in Britain, the state, which is very good at controlling costs. In America, you're weird. You've got massive amounts of cost, of responsibility shifting, and of course then rent seek on the part of these gigantic health organizations. The other thing I would talk about, which is a huge problem, I think, is in the United States, is disability benefits. The proportion of the population on disability benefits has gone from very small, 1 or 2% in 1960, let's say, to about 5% and rising of the population. About 11 million people are on disability benefits. And once you're on disability benefits, you almost never get off disability benefits. So you can, partly because they go up every year, partly because they pay your healthcare costs, which people are very worried about, and partly because there's no mechanism for retraining people. So once you're on the disability benefit, you're outside the training system. And this system is getting worse and worse. I think it's beginning to grow, and many people, because they face a choice between stagnant wages and expensive healthcare or going onto these disability benefits, shift themselves onto this thing. And I think one recent study that I looked at suggested that after 10 years on disability benefits, only 4% of people who got on the system actually got off it. So that is an area of very concerning increase in entitlements, which is not doing anybody much good. And America does have now a crisis of employability, a crisis of male participation in particular in the labor force. It has one of the lowest labor force participation rates in the OECD, in the rich world at the moment. Israel, I think, is lower, but America's is low, and this is partly because of these people just dropping out of the labor force entirely and becoming dependent on the state in various ways.
I want to try to, that's great, maximize our time. A couple more questions. I think we have Chris Giles first. Oh, sorry, Alan. Yeah, Alan, do you?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Chris, this is better maximization of our time.
It's not the deficits, it's basically the issue of not funding increased expenditures.
Right.
Yep.
The issue of disability and most anything else in the entitlement system could be resolved politically and economically if we funded them. You know, as you know, I put in one of our copies that at page 299 in the 2017 or 18 annual report of the Social Security actuaries. They say basically that to get the system into actuarial balance, you have to cut benefits by 25% forever into the future. Now that system violates what we're doing there. It's pretending that we have balance, but we're not. If you're looking for the page numbers, it's just before 299, but it's not in that book. What I'm saying is that we got to recognize the issue is that we don't have the political will to fund those projects which we insist upon implementing.
Yeah. And this is a key point in the book, and I won't name the presidency, but in the last 30 years, the shift from new programs funded to unfunded, which is driving. Okay, Chris, you've been patient, as always.
Thank you, Chris Giles from the Financial Times. I just wanted to talk again about the entitlement issue that seems to be central to many aspects of the book. If the problem is not enough creative destruction today in the US, it seems odd to say that the cause of that is too much entitlements when you can look around the world where there are systems which have both more creative destruction, like you mentioned Sweden, and have much greater entitlements. And if it's not about, if it's about a financial or fiscal consequence, so not enough funding of entitlements, no one's mentioned tax increases. Is this just not something we do at Policy Exchange, or is this actually maybe the solution to the entitlement problem?
Whom do you wish to ask?
Alan, I'll if I can turn that to you first. The core of it, if I may, why not fund the? It's picking up a bit on the last your last answer. Why not fund some of these expenditures with higher taxes? And alternatively, there are other countries with high entitlements, and what are the, if I may, Chris, what are the implicitly, what are the lessons, if any, from there? One point in the book is about Swedish entitlement reform as an example for the U.S. But Alan, do you want to expand?
No, I think that's precisely the issue. You're going to raise Sweden. It's a perfect example as to a country which had precisely the type of problem we are confronting in the United States here today. They solved it. And the answers I usually get back from people saying, well, they're a small country. To be sure, they are a small country. And indeed, they're very small relative to the United States. But entitlements for all sorts of benefits of that type are not based on the size. They're all unit per person, and you cannot get a solution to the problem by saying, well, this small country doesn't apply, when in fact what is involved is each individual person's policies, their life expectancy, their benefits are unique in themselves, and they are not additive. So if you've got a problem actuarially, it is not solvable in the context of saying, well, we don't have to look at what Sweden did. In fact, what we're suggesting in the book is it's precisely what Sweden did, which is the answer to what can happen, must happen in the United States. They have the political courage and capability, apparently, of solving this problem. We have yet to show them.
Okay.
On the issue of tax increases, I mean, I think tax increases might or might not do something, but I think in terms of the biggest thing you can do is actually have an older age of retirement and link retirement to life expectancy, as indeed they've done in Sweden. So I think that's more of a long-term solution to the problem than open-ended tax increases. The second thing is that I do think that America's rate of creative destruction has gone down for many reasons, partly entitlements, partly high degrees of regulation. But I would not say that creative destruction is less operative in the United States than Sweden. I admire Sweden hugely, but I still think the industries of tomorrow are still overwhelmingly being created in the United States.
Okay. So we're almost out of time, or slightly over time. This being Policy Exchange, there's time for one question, but I should auction it. Who really wants to ask? Okay. Sir. There.
Thank you very much. Callum Pickering from Berenberg Bank. I know you focus a lot on the book of the complacency of innovators causing a major problem. I wonder to what extent in modern times we have a cultural change. So take, for example, robotics. It has the potential for major gains in prosperity. Now, by your message, we should just not interfere with this creative process. But when it comes to major entrepreneurs, say the Elon Musks of the world, the Bill Gates, they advocate taxation of robots or using policy to slow down this innovative process. I don't imagine Mr. Carney would have advocated the same sort of thing in his day. So to what extent do we now have a different set of cultural expectations from innovators and those that participate in this process in modern times? And is that not a major issue that policymakers are going to have to face down? Because I know when it comes to government, they'd much rather listen to, say, Mr. Musk than, say, Mr. Greenspan or an economist or yourself, on the basis that these are the so-called good and great of society now, whereas, say, the economists, the financial sector, that may advocate allowing this process just to take place would be, yeah, you see my point.
Well, I'm not sure I do see your point.
Alan, do you?
If you get robots to pay their taxes, that would solve the problem.
That's a good way to do it. Okay, so we tax all the robots, and the rest of us can run free. Well, look, we are out of time. Adrian, thank you for coming here. Dean, for organizing. Andrew Downer and everyone with Policy Exchange, but particularly Alan, can I thank you for making the time to be part of this conversation and for writing this book. It is an incredibly important book. It gets to the heart of the dynamics of our economies, of the system, how they work, and how we can potentially put sand in the gears of the core of the system. And so thank you for the time. Thank you all for attending, for your questions.
Thank you.
Onwards and upwards.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.